The heavy oak doors of the oubliette splintered under the weight of Alaric's grief, not his strength. Inside, the scent was a suffocating cocktail of ancient dust and wilting lilies. He didn't need to see her to know she was here. His blood hummed a frantic, mournful rhythm against his ribs. "You hit her," Alaric growled, his voice a low vibration that cracked the stone pillars. He stepped over the threshold, his gaze fixed on the shadow in the corner. "You buried my soul in the dark, and you let her rot." There, on a bed of decaying velvet, lay Seraphina. She was a ghost of the princess he had once courted, her elegant frame brittle, her breathing a shallow, jagged rasp. And as his eyes adjusted, he saw it. The horror of what had been torn from her. The oubliette was a place designed to erase existence, but it had failed to erase Seraphina. Alaric moved with the predatory grace of a creature who had lived for centuries, his boots silent on the cold, damp stone. He ignored the cowering figure of the Queen Mother, who stood clutching a rosary made of obsidian, her face a mask of aristocratic terror. She was irrelevant now. All that mattered was the figure draped in tattered silk, a gown that had once been the envy of the French-influenced courts of the north, now nothing more than a shroud. "Alaric," the Queen Mother hissed, her voice trembling like dry leaves. "You cannot be here. The Covenant is dust," Alaric interrupted, his eyes never leaving Seraphina. He knelt beside the bed. Up close, the tragedy was sharper. Her skin, once reminiscent of cream and rose petals, was translucent, mapped by veins that pulsed with a feverish, unnatural light. He reached out, his calloused fingers hovering inches from her cheek. He was an ancient king, a being of shadow and mountain-born strength, but he was afraid to touch her. He feared that if he applied the slightest pressure, she would shatter like fine porcelain. "She is dying," he whispered, the realization tasting like ash. "She is fulfilling her purpose," the Queen Mother retorted, regaining a sliver of her composure. "She was born to be the anchor, Alaric, to keep the rift closed. She was not born to be your pet." Alaric turned his head slowly. The air in the room grew heavy, the temperature plummeting until the Queen Mother's breath turned to mist. "A pet? You speak of your daughter as if she were a trinket, and yet you stole her from the only creature in this realm who would have died to protect her." He looked back at Seraphina. Even in this state, there was a residual elegance to her. Her hair, though matted, still held the silver-blonde hue of her lineage. She was intelligent, cunning, and trapped. He could see the faint, rhythmic twitching of her fingers. A code, perhaps, or merely the nervous system firing in protest against her confinement. He didn't need to ask why the mother had done it. Power. Always power. The royal bloodline required a sacrifice, and what better sacrifice than a mate to an alpha king? Alaric finally reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from Seraphina's forehead. The moment his skin touched hers, a shock wave rippled through the room. Dust motes danced in the sudden surge of static energy. He gasped, pulling his hand back as if burned. But it wasn't heat. It was an absence. There was a hole in her soul. A jagged, cauterized space where her core essence should have been. It had been surgically extracted, leaving behind a husk of magic that kept her biologically alive but spiritually hollow. "What did you do to her?" Alaric's voice was lethal, a sound that promised the slow dismantling of a kingdom. The Queen Mother scoffed, though she took a step back, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. "I did what was necessary for the peace of the realm. You, the Alpha King, are a force of chaos. To keep the borders of the kingdom safe, the anchor must be stable. And to be stable, she had to be purged of her wildness." "You tore the Alpha bond from her," Alaric realized, his voice trembling. He understood now. It wasn't just that she had been imprisoned. She had been gutted. The connection they shared, the deep, primordial link that made them two halves of a whole, had been severed to prevent him from tracking her, to prevent them from joining forces and overturning the stale, rotting structure of the court. Seraphina's eyelids fluttered. Alaric ignored the mother entirely now, his focus locked on his mate. "Seraphina," he murmured, his voice softening, shedding the predatory edge. Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. They were the color of storm-tossed seas, clouded by years of darkness but sharpening as they found him. She didn't smile. She couldn't. Her muscles were too atrophied. But her gaze, intense, calculating, brilliant, locked onto his. She blinked, a slow, deliberate movement. She wasn't gone. The mother had failed. The torn essence hadn't killed her. It had simply forced her to build a cage within her own mind to survive the extraction. She was waiting. "Alaric," she breathed. The word barely a whisper, yet it sounded like a victory bell to him. "I am here," he promised, his eyes glowing with a faint, dangerous amber light. "And I am taking you home." The oubliette was not merely a prison. It was a sensory deprivation chamber designed by the royal architects to dampen the soul. As Alaric scooped Seraphina into his arms, the weight of her, or rather, the lack of it, sent a fresh wave of fury through his veins. She was light as dried autumn leaves, yet to him she felt heavier than the mountain he ruled. "You think you can just walk out?" The Queen Mother's voice had lost its veneer of regal authority, replaced by the shrill desperation of a cornered predator. She reached into her robes, withdrawing a small, silver whistle, etched with blackened runes. "The guards are not men, Alaric. They are bound by the same covenant you swore to break." Alaric didn't turn. He simply tightened his grip on Seraphina, his eyes fixed on the heavy iron-reinforced door. "Then let them come. I have been bored for 3 centuries. A little bloodletting is long overdue." The room groaned. The stone walls, saturated with decades of the Queen Mother's dark magic, began to vibrate. From the shadows beneath the floorboards, entities emerged, the hollowed-out husks of those who had failed the covenant in ages past. They were mindless automatons, their eyes glowing with a sickly, bruised violet light. Seraphina, her head resting against Alaric's chest, stirred. Her hand moved, grasping his tunic with a grip that was surprisingly firm for someone so frail. She didn't speak. She couldn't. But she looked at the encroaching shadows with a calm, analytical gaze. She wasn't afraid. She was observing. "Stay behind me," Alaric commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to physically push back the encroaching darkness. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He allowed his own aura to flare outward. Not the controlled, refined power of a king, but the raw, unbridled force of a predator protecting his territory. The temperature in the oubliette plummeted until the moisture in the air turned to frost. The husks hesitated. They recognized the scent of the true alpha. "Kill him!" the Queen Mother shrieked, blowing the whistle. A sound like tearing metal filled the room. The husks lunged. Alaric moved with a speed that defied the physical world. He didn't swing. He existed. Every step he took sent a shockwave through the ground, splintering the stone. He wove through the guards, his movements elegant yet brutal, leaving behind a wake of shattered magic and broken bodies. He wasn't killing them. He was unmaking them, ripping the commands from their hollow shells until they collapsed into piles of dust and rusted armor. Within seconds, the Queen Mother stood alone, her whistle dropping from her trembling fingers. Alaric stopped before her. He was breathless, but not from exertion. His eyes were no longer amber. They were the color of an impending storm. "You have played with forces you do not understand," he said, his voice quiet, which was somehow more terrifying than his shout. "You think you caged the light, but you only created a void, and voids have a way of consuming everything around them." The purpose of this chapter was to contrast Alaric's raw physical power with the Queen Mother's artificial, borrowed authority. Notice how Seraphina's reaction shifts. She is the witness, not the damsel. By showing her observing the guards, we reinforce the intelligent cunning trait established earlier. They were in the subterranean tunnels beneath the capital, far from the light of day. The air was damp and smelled of stagnant river water. Alaric kept a steady pace, his strides long and deliberate. He had fashioned a makeshift cloak out of the heavy drapes he'd ripped from the oubliette's entrance, wrapping Seraphina to shield her from the biting cold of the tunnels. She was shivering, but she kept her eyes on the path ahead, her gaze flicking between every shadow. "We are heading for the west gate," Alaric murmured, his voice softer now, attuned to the delicate state of his mate. "Once we cross the boundary of the kingdom, the Covenant's reach will fade. You will be able to breathe again." Seraphina looked up at him. She touched her throat, a soft, raspy sound escaping her lips. "No." Alaric slowed to a stop, his brow furrowing. "No? What do you mean, no? We have to leave. You are fading, Seraphina. My strength is only holding you together by a thread." She pulled away slightly, gesturing toward the way they had come. Her hand was shaking, but her fingers traced a complex pattern in the air, a sigil he hadn't seen in centuries. She was trying to tell him that the anchor wasn't just a roll. It was a literal, physical tether to the kingdom's stability. If she left, the kingdom wouldn't just lose its protector. It would break. "The kingdom is rotting, Seraphina," Alaric growled, frustration leaking into his voice. "Let it break. It deserves to fall for what it did to you." She shook her head violently, her eyes widening. She reached out, placing a palm against his chest, right over his heart. Her touch was cold, but the sensation it triggered was electric. Through the physical contact, a flood of imagery rushed into his mind. He saw the city above, not as it was, but as it was failing. He saw the fissures in the earth, the tremors in the foundations, the way the sky was beginning to bleed shadow. The Queen Mother hadn't just used Seraphina as a tool. She had used her as a dam. If Seraphina walked away, the dam would burst. The shadow would swallow everything. The innocent, the guilty, the architecture of the city, the very soil they stood on. Alaric staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. "You aren't just an anchor for the rift," he whispered, the realization tasting like copper. "You're the keystone for the entire realm." Seraphina nodded, her expression grim. She was dying, yes, but she was also the only thing holding the world together. The cruelty of it was staggering. Even in her weakened state, she had maintained the barrier, quietly, silently, for years, refusing to let the chaos consume the land that had betrayed her. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the depth of her sacrifice. She wasn't just elegant and intelligent. She was monumental. "Then we don't leave," Alaric decided, a dark, dangerous resolve settling over him. "We stay, and we rewrite the rules of this kingdom entirely." The tunnels beneath the capital were not merely stone and mortar. They were the nervous system of the city, and right now, that system was suffering from a massive infection. As Alaric walked, the walls groaned in sympathy with Seraphina's ragged breathing. Every step he took felt like treading on broken glass, not because of the terrain, but because of the psychic pressure radiating from his mate. She was the keystone. The realization left a bitter taste in Alaric's mouth, a metallic tang of impending catastrophe. By holding the rift closed, Seraphina had been bearing the crushing weight of the kingdom's darkness for years. Now, as she moved away from the oubliette, that pressure was beginning to distribute itself unevenly across the structural integrity of the city above. "Stop!" Alaric commanded, his voice tight. He felt a tremor roll through the floorboards beneath them, a distinct, rhythmic thrumming that felt suspiciously like a heartbeat. Seraphina stumbled, her strength finally wavering. Alaric caught her, pulling her close. The air around her skin shimmered with a pale, violet light. The same necrotic energy that had been forced into her veins. It was leaking out, trying to stitch the reality of the tunnel together as it frayed. "You're bleeding magic," Alaric noted, his eyes narrowing. He pressed his hand against the small of her back, funneling his own, darker energy into her to stabilize the output. It was a dangerous gamble. If he flooded her with too much, he could accidentally ignite the very chaos he was trying to contain. Seraphina looked up, her eyes clouded with pain but remarkably clear in their focus. She raised a trembling hand, pointing not toward the exit, but back toward the heart of the palace. The rift isn't just a place, he realized, the thought dawning on him like a slow-moving storm. It's a tether. The Queen Mother hadn't just used her as a guard, she had used her as a battery. And if the battery was pulled from the circuit, the surge would be catastrophic. "If we leave," Alaric whispered, looking at the ceiling where dust was already beginning to rain down. the whole city falls, they would blame you. They would call you the destroyer. Seraphina didn't look at him with fear. She looked at him with a resigned, weary nobility that made his chest ache. She had known this all along. She had been protecting people who had let her rot in a cell for years. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of her character humbled him. "You are too good for them," he growled, the possessiveness in his voice bordering on feral. "Let it fall, Seraphina. Let them see what happens when their savior is taken." But she shook her head, a soft, determined tilt of her chin. She wasn't fighting for the Queen Mother. She was fighting for the thousands of lives that knew nothing of the oubliette, nothing of the dark covenants of the ruling class. She was a queen in every sense but title, carrying the weight of a world that didn't deserve her. Alaric gritted his teeth, the dark ambition within him warring with the sudden, overwhelming instinct to protect what was his. "Then we don't destroy it," he decided, his voice low and dangerous. "We rewrite it." Back in the upper chambers, the silence was deafening. The Queen Mother sat on the dais, her fingers clutching the velvet of her throne until her knuckles turned white. The whistle, now useless on the floor, felt like a silent witness to her failure. The guards were in disarray. Without the rhythmic guiding hum of Seraphina's spirit, the castle felt empty. The ambient magic that usually kept the tapestries bright and the air fresh was flickering, dimming, replaced by the damp, oppressive scent of the earth. "My lady." A captain of the guard stepped forward, his armor clanking softly. "The tremors, they're worsening in the lower levels. The surveyors say the foundation is cracking." The Queen Mother didn't turn. "Let it crack. The rift will hold." "It isn't holding, my lady. The Alpha King, he isn't just stealing the asset. He's unraveling the bond." She finally looked up, her eyes flashing with a mix of fury and genuine terror. She had underestimated the Alpha. She had treated him like a beast that could be caged or a rival that could be manipulated. She hadn't realized that for an entity like Alaric, a bond wasn't a contract. It was a biological imperative. "Seal the lower levels," she ordered, her voice trembling. "Collapse the tunnels. If we cannot have the anchor, we will bury the source of the rot." The captain hesitated. "The structural integrity of the palace, my lady." "I said collapse them!" she shrieked, the command resonating with a burst of dark energy that shattered a nearby vase. Up in the tunnels, the sound of stone shifting echoed down the long, dark corridor. Alaric's ears swiveled, his senses sharpening. He felt the shift in the earth, a deliberate, violent contraction. "They're trying to bury us," he said, pulling Seraphina tighter to his side. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the layout of this castle better than the architects who had built it. It was a relic of a time when the Alpha Kings ruled the surface, not the shadows. "Hold on to me," he instructed, his voice dropping to a gravelly, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. Seraphina obeyed, wrapping her arms around his waist. Alaric closed his eyes, centering himself. He reached out with his mind, not to the stone, but to the shadows themselves. They were his kin, the darkness his ancient ally. He demanded passage. He demanded a path. The ground didn't just move, it bowed. A fissure opened in the solid rock, not where the architects had intended, but where he commanded. It was an impossible feat, a display of raw, primeval power that would have left any other creature drained and hollow. But he wasn't just any creature. He was the king of the unseen. As they stepped through the shimmering veil of shadows, the last thing they heard was the muffled, distant sound of the palace roof buckling under the weight of the Queen Mother's hubris. They hadn't just escaped. They had walked out of the enemy's trap and into the heart of their own domain. The transition between the suffocating engineered stillness of the capital and the vibrant, untamed chaos of the shadow realm was not a shift in geography, but a shattering of reality. Alaric didn't just step into the darkness. He stepped into his own backyard. Here, the laws of the Queen Mother's court, laws of rigidity, caste, and hollow tradition, did not apply. They stood on a ridge overlooking a valley that pulsed with a bioluminescent violet glow. The trees here were woven from obsidian-like bark and leaves that shimmered like spilled oil, swaying in a wind that carried the scent of ozone and ancient earth. It was beautiful, dangerous, and utterly free. Seraphina stumbled as Alaric let her go. Her legs, unused to anything but the flat stone of her cell, buckled. Alaric caught her instantly, his movements fluid. He eased her down onto a bed of moss that felt as plush as velvet. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice losing that gravelly edge of rage and softening into something more grounding. "The air here is thick with magic. It will feed you." Seraphina leaned back against a gnarled trunk, closing her eyes. She inhaled deeply, and for a moment, her entire body seemed to glow, a faint pulse of necrotic energy turning into something luminous. She looked at him, her eyes clearer than they had been in years. "You brought us to the vein," she murmured, her voice still raspy but gaining strength. "The legends said the Alpha Kings abandoned this place because it was too chaotic to control." "Legends are written by the victors," Alaric retorted, pacing the small clearing. He was restless, his energy still humming with the adrenaline of the escape. "I didn't abandon it. I let it grow. A kingdom that is purely ordered is a kingdom that is dead. I needed a wild heart to balance the cold intellect of the world above." He knelt beside her, checking the wounds, both physical and magical, that the oubliette had inflicted. "We need to talk about the keystone. You weren't just a battery, Seraphina. You were a filter. If the city is falling apart without you, then the Queen Mother has no idea how to actually maintain the barrier. She just knows how to harvest the one person who could." Seraphina traced the moss with her finger. "She thinks magic is a resource to be mined," she said, her tone sharp with a sudden, intellectual clarity. "She treats the kingdom like a ledger, assets and liabilities. You and I? We are the greatest liability to her balance sheet." Alaric grinned, a predatory, shark-like expression that didn't reach his eyes, because his eyes were entirely focused on her. "Then we make the ledger bleed red. You know the architecture of the spell, Seraphina. You know exactly which bricks hold up the house of cards the Queen Mother built." "I do," she admitted, looking at the distant, shimmering skyline of the capital, visible even from here like a glowing ember in the dark. "But to pull the keystone out is to let the roof fall. We have to do more than just collapse it. We have to build something underneath to catch the debris." Alaric sat back, impressed. He had expected her to be broken, perhaps vengeful, but he hadn't fully anticipated the cold, calculating strategist beneath the survivor. He had rescued a mate, yes, but he realized with a jolt of exhilaration that he had also rescued his equal. "We have time," Alaric said, reaching out to touch her hand. "We have the shadows, we have the history, and now we have the architect." Back in the capital, the victory of the Queen Mother was tasting increasingly like ash. The collapse of the palace tunnels had been reported as a structural anomaly, a convenient lie for the masses who were already whispering about the tremors. But the nobility knew better. The air in the throne room felt thin, stale. The tapestries, once vibrant and rich with protective embroidery, were fraying at the edges. The Queen Mother stood in the center of the hall, her hands trembling as she adjusted the heavy, ornate rings on her fingers. She was waiting for the report on the casualty count, or perhaps on the Alpha King's corpse. The captain of the guard approached, his boots heavy on the marble. He stopped, saluting with a fervor that looked forced. "My lady, the search teams, they found the tunnels sealed, impenetrably." "And the bodies?" she snapped, not turning around. "None, my lady, just footprints, and signs that the rock was moved by hand or by claw." She gripped the back of her throne until her knuckles burned. The Alpha was not dead. He was out there, and he had taken the keystone with him. "Double the patrols," she commanded, her voice brittle. "And find the source of the dampening. The magic is leaking, Captain. Do you feel it? The tapestries are dulling. The candles won't stay lit." "The people are frightened, my lady," the captain ventured, his voice barely a whisper. "They say the spirits are restless. They say the princess is calling out." The Queen Mother whipped around, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and fear. "Silence! She is a traitor, a weapon that was turned against the crown." She dismissed him with a flick of her hand, pacing the dais. She had thought that by locking Seraphina away, she had secured her reign. She hadn't realized that Seraphina was a living conduit. By removing her, the Queen Mother hadn't just lost a guard. She had removed the stabilizer from the entire magical grid. Crack! The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. A spiderweb fracture appeared on the pristine marble floor, snaking out from beneath the throne. The Queen Mother gasped, looking down. The stone wasn't just cracking. It was decaying. It was as if the ground itself was rejecting her presence. She reached into her robes to touch the silver whistle, but she stopped. She remembered Alaric's voice. Voids have a way of consuming everything around them. She had created a void, yes, but she hadn't realized that nature, especially the nature of the Alpha King, hated a vacuum. From the corners of the room, a low, rhythmic sound began to emanate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the settling of the foundation. It was a melody, a soft, haunting, lyrical hum that Seraphina used to sing during the solstice rites. It was a memory, bleeding out of the walls themselves. The Queen Mother clapped her hands over her ears, but the sound didn't come from the air. It vibrated in her bones. "She's here," the Queen Mother hissed, staring at the shadows in the corners of the room. "She's haunting us." But it wasn't a haunting. It was a countdown. Seraphina hadn't left. She had simply shifted the focus of her power, from being a prisoner to being a parasite, siphoning the life force of the palace to sustain her own recovery. The Queen Mother was slowly starving to death, her very throne room consuming her power to fuel the princess's rebellion. The throne room was no longer a symbol of imperial majesty. It was a tomb. The ceiling groaned, great cracks spiderwebbing across the vaulted arches, shedding stone dust that coated everything in a fine, gray powder. The tapestries, once vibrant depictions of the Queen Mother's lineage, hung like flayed skin from the walls. The Queen Mother knelt on the dais, her fingers clawing at the empty air as if she could stitch the reality of her kingdom back together. She was no longer a regal figure of authority. She was a woman unraveling, her eyes darting to the corners of the room where the shadows, thick, liquid, and sentient, were encroaching. The heavy doors groaned on their hinges, then exploded inward. They didn't fall to the floor. They disintegrated into shadow before they even touched the ground. Alaric walked in first. He didn't need to brandish a weapon. His presence alone was a weight that suppressed the very air. Behind him walked Seraphina. She was different now. The sickly pallor was gone, replaced by a radiant, terrifying clarity. She moved with the grace of a predator who had finally remembered how to hunt. The Queen Mother scrambled backward, her back hitting the throne. "You," she whispered, her voice a ragged thread. "You were meant to be the seal. You were meant to be the silence." "I was the lock," Seraphina said, her voice echoing in the chamber with a resonance that wasn't entirely her own. It was the collective voice of the shadows she had been holding back for years. "And you, Mother, broke the key." Alaric stepped onto the dais, his boots crunching on the decayed marble. He didn't look at the Queen Mother with hate. He looked at her with the detached curiosity one might afford a dying insect. "Look around you," he commanded, gesturing to the cracking walls. "Your kingdom is built on a lie. You treated the world as a resource to be stripped, and now the resource has dried up." "I did what I had to," she shrieked, clutching her chest. "The rift, the darkness, it would have consumed us all without my guidance." "No," Alaric corrected, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You fed it. You harvested the life force of the people to keep your gilded cage bright, and you used Seraphina to filter the rot so you wouldn't have to smell it." Seraphina stepped closer, her eyes glowing with that faint, bioluminescent violet that marked her as the new conduit. She raised a hand, and the shadows in the room surged, coalescing into forms, spirits, memories, the ghosts of the covenant she had upheld for too long. "You thought you were a queen," she said, her tone devoid of mercy. "But you were merely a parasite on a host that is now shaking you off." The Queen Mother opened her mouth to scream, but the sound died in her throat. The floor beneath her throne didn't just crack. It dissolved, turning into a swirling vortex of darkness. She clawed at the stone, but there was no purchase. The very palace she had fortified against the Alpha King was now welcoming him home. "Let it go," Alaric whispered, and she did. She vanished into the abyss, not with a roar, but with a soft, final sigh as the last of her borrowed power evaporated. The silence that followed was absolute. The palace stopped shaking. The air, heavy with centuries of artificial order, suddenly shifted. It tasted of rain, ozone, and unbridled potential. Alaric turned to Seraphina. She looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the moment beginning to fade, but she held his gaze with unwavering strength. The keystone role she had played, the burden that had nearly killed her, was now something they shared. A bond that was no longer a cage, but a bridge. "The roof is falling," she noted, looking up at the groaning ceiling. "Let it," Alaric agreed, reaching for her hand. "We have a kingdom to build, and this time we start from the earth up." As the throne room began to surrender to the weight of time, they walked out together, not as prisoners, not as survivors, but as the architects of a new, wilder world. The throne room fell, but in its place, the foundations of something new were already taking root. Alaric and Seraphina didn't just survive the collapse. They embraced the transition, stepping out of the shadows of the past and into the dawn of a reign defined by balance rather than control. The Alpha King had finally claimed his mate, but more importantly, they had reclaimed their future together. If you enjoyed this journey through the shadowed halls of the Alpha King and the Architect, please like this story, share it with a friend who loves a dark fantasy, and subscribe for more tales of power, betrayal, and the bonds that refuse to break. The kingdom has been rewritten. What would you like to see happen in the next stage of their rule? Chapter 10. The Architect's Garden. The silence that followed the fall of the throne room was not empty. It was pregnant with possibility. 6 months had passed since the palace had surrendered to the earth, and in its place, the capital was no longer a place of rigid order and hollow traditions. It was a garden, though not one of roses and well-kept hedges. It was a garden of stone and shadow, where bioluminescent fungi clung to new, sturdy foundations, and the city breathed with the rhythm of the wild. Alaric stood on the balcony of the new assembly hall, a modest, sprawling structure built from the reclaimed stone of the old palace. He watched the streets below. People moved with purpose. They were no longer the hushed, fearful subjects of a decaying crown. They were settlers, craftsmen, and dreamers who had realized that survival wasn't about holding on to the past, but nurturing the future. Seraphina stepped out beside him, her hand resting on the smooth, cool railing. She wore no crown, only a silver circlet that caught the dim, violet light of the late afternoon. She was no longer the frail captive of the oubliette. Her eyes were sharp, bright, and deeply alive. "The resonance is stabilizing," she murmured, feeling the pulse of the city beneath her feet. "The shadows are no longer encroaching, Alaric. They are settling." Alaric turned, his gaze softening as he looked at her. He placed a hand over hers. "They follow the Architect," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You have woven them into the foundation. It's a piece I never thought possible for my kind." "It's not just your kind, or mine," Seraphina corrected, looking out at the mosaic of humans and shadow-touched folk working together. "It's a synthesis. The old kingdom was a closed circuit, consuming itself. This is an ecosystem." He had feared that once the adrenaline of the rebellion faded, they would be bored, or worse, that he would revert to the savage, solitary instincts that had defined his centuries as the Alpha King. But Seraphina had given him a different kind of hunt. The pursuit of order, justice, and growth. "There are still those who grumble about the new laws," Alaric noted, though there was no malice in his tone. "They miss the certainty of the Queen Mother's rule. They miss the predictability of chains." "Let them grumble," Seraphina replied with a small, knowing smile. "Change is the only absolute, Alaric. They will learn that the freedom of this new world is worth the price of uncertainty." She looked up at the sky, where the veil between the realms was thin, shimmering like heat haze. She had built this, and she was already planning what came next. She was the architect, and the work was never truly finished. "We have a meeting with the trade guilds at sunset," she reminded him. "And you promised the healers you would inspect the new clinics in the lower districts." Alaric chuckled, a sound that resonated with genuine warmth. He had spent his long life as a myth, a monster in the dark. Now he was a king, a partner, and a builder. "I remember," he said, stepping away from the balcony to walk with her. "But first, I think the king and his architect deserve a moment of quiet. The harvest is coming, and I hear the shadow wheat is looking particularly strong." As they turned to leave the balcony, the city below hummed, not with the sound of a falling empire, but with the steady, growing heartbeat of a new beginning. The assembly hall was not designed for pageantry, which made the arrival of the northern delegation feel all the more jarring. They stood in the center of the room, 3 men cloaked in heavy furs, clashing against the bioluminescent, earthy aesthetic of the new capital. They were representatives of the High Lords, the last remnants of the old regime who had prospered under the Queen Mother's exploitative trade agreements. Alaric stood on the dais, his presence a silent, suffocating weight. He wore no armor, only simple dark linen, but his posture was that of a predator watching encroaching prey. Seraphina sat beside him, not on a throne, but in a high-backed chair carved from the very wood of the new city. She looked at the delegation with a stillness that was far more unsettling than Alaric's intensity. "We come to offer terms," the lead envoy said, his voice clipped and cold. He didn't bow. "The High Lords are concerned. The recent collapse of the capital's magical grid has caused significant disruptions in trade. We are prepared to offer our expertise and our resources to stabilize your experimental city. In exchange, of course, for a return to the previous tax and resource protocols." Alaric's hand flexed at his side. He wanted to throw the man through the stone wall. He felt the familiar pull of the shadow, the itch of his claws beneath his skin. Seraphina sensed the change in him instantly. She didn't look at him. She simply rested her hand over his, her palm cool and firm. The touch grounded him, anchoring the storm of his rage. "Stabilize?" Seraphina repeated, her voice light, conversational. "The grid is not broken, envoy. It is evolving. It no longer requires the extraction of life force to maintain its structure. I am surprised the High Lords haven't noticed. Or perhaps they are simply disappointed that the tithe of energy has ceased to flow." The envoy's face tightened. "We are talking about economic stability, Princess. Your evolution is causing famine in the outer territories. The shadows you cultivate consume the crops. You are starving your neighbors." "We are not cultivating shadows," Alaric interjected, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that silenced the room. "We are living in symbiosis with them. If your farmers starve, it is because they insist on planting the same blighted seeds in soil that no longer accepts them. Tell your lords that the era of forced harvesting is over. If they want trade, they will negotiate as equals, not as masters." The envoy smirked. It was a sneer, barely masked by diplomacy. "Equality is a pretty word, King, but hunger is a powerful master. We have no interest in negotiating. We have come to deliver an ultimatum. Allow us to install our geomancers to fix the grid, or we will embargo your shipments of ore and grain. You have 3 days to decide." As they turned to leave, the silence in the hall was absolute. "They think we are desperate," Alaric murmured, watching them go. "They think we are brittle," Seraphina corrected, a faint, dangerous smile touching her lips. "They think that because we are no longer using the Queen Mother's methods, we have lost the ability to wield her power. They have no idea how much stronger we are when we aren't fighting our own nature." "What do we do?" Alaric asked, looking at her. The hunt was simple. Governance, he was finding, was far more complex. "We don't negotiate," she said, rising from her seat. "We show them exactly why the Queen Mother was so afraid of the shadows." This chapter introduces the diplomatic antagonist. The conflict shifts from the internal struggle, the Queen Mother, to the external, the High Lords. It tests the partnership. Alaric's instinct is to use force, while Seraphina's strategy is to use the environment itself. The twist is that the antagonists are playing an economic game, which requires a much more cunning response.